So, just a few days ago, Leica has released the new version of this camera. Well, not this camera actually, but the new Leica Q3 43. And while I do not have one, I have spent a, unreasonable and probably unhealthy amount of time over the past few days thinking about it. And I've been asking myself the question of whether or not it might be a worthwhile idea to upgrade, so to speak, from this Leica Q2 to the new Leica Q3 43. Now, in case you're new to this channel, hello, thanks for stopping by. My name is Tobias and I am a longtime owner and user of the Leica Q2. I've been shooting with that camera pretty much solely for the past 3 years or so. And it is by far my favorite camera of all times. And I love it to bits. However, its main headline feature, the fixed 28mm Summilux lens, can also sometimes be its biggest disadvantage. For me personally, my two favorite focal lengths are actually 28mm and 50mm. And with this fixed 28mm lens, if you want to have a 50mm full frame equivalent field of view, the only option you have really is to crop into your image. Now, the new Leica Q3 43 comes with a 43mm lens, hence the name of the camera, and it also sports the same 60 megapixel sensor as the regular Q3 does. Truth be told, I'm a bit surprised that it has taken Leica this long to come up with this camera, because ever since I started getting interested in the Leica Q line of cameras back in the days when there was only the original Leica Q out there, and I was watching videos of people like Evan Ranft who had the Leica QP back in the days. Even back then, people were already saying that they do love the Leica Q, but that they would love to have a version with a 35mm or even a 50mm lens. And well, I guess Leica simply couldn't decide whether to go with a 35 or a 50mm lens, and so they just decided to split the difference and meet in the middle, and so they ended up with a 43mm lens. But that's completely fine by me. Leica themselves say that it is the most natural focal length, and I tend to agree with that statement. And also, over the past few years or so, 40mm or something in between 40 and 50mm has kind of become the new go-to focal range for many people. And so because of that, I'm fairly certain that the new Leica Q3 43 will sell like nothing else, even despite its insanely high price tag of almost 7 grand. And not gonna lie, if I had the money to just spend on a camera like this, I would most likely just go out and buy a 43 myself. But for me, that would mean that I would have to sell my beloved Leica Q2. And after thinking about that for a while, I think that I've come to the conclusion that I should just stay with this camera. Let me explain. You see, the beauty of my Leica Q2 here, or well, any Leica Q in fact, is the fact that it comes with a fixed lens. And that allows this camera to be fairly compact. Now, I know it's not as compact as a Fuji X100 or a Ricoh GR3, shut up, but it's still fairly compact for a full frame camera with a lens of this type. And also, since it is a completely sealed off unit, it is incredibly rugged. I have used my Leica Q2 in all kinds of unfavorable conditions, from sandy beaches to blizzards in Iceland, and it has never missed a beat, even though I've used it for hours and hours and hours on end in downpours. It just is never bothered. It hasn't missed a beat. It's built like an absolute tank. Now, this, however, obviously comes at the cost of not being able to switch between different focal lengths, and that makes the decision of which lens you start with all the more important. And so you should really think about whether or not the lens and the focal length that the camera comes with would be the best fit for your shooting style. And for me personally, there are basically just two types of photography that I get to indulge in on a somewhat regular basis. And the first type would be just what I would call everyday photography. That means lifestyle photography, documentary photography, essentially just capturing memories, taking photos along the way while I'm basically just doing whatever it is that I'm doing. That might be just sitting at a restaurant or being at a wedding or traveling to whatever foreign countries that my wife and I might want to travel to. And the second category are those days where I leave the house with the specific goal to take photos, be that landscape photography, street photography, or whatever. And so the main difference between those two categories for me is essentially that for the first category, taking photos is essentially just a byproduct of whatever it is that I'm doing anyway. And for the second category, taking photos is actually the main goal here. Now, in my experience and for my style of shooting, I would say that for everything related to that first category, the everyday sort of photography, 28 millimeters is actually perfect. And I've really never wished for my Q2 to have a different focal length while I'm using it for that sort of thing. Whereas I would almost always prefer to have something closer to a 50 millimeter lens for everything out of the second category. Now, a 28 millimeter lens allows me to capture things that are close to me while still allowing for a bit of context of the surroundings, which in my view is exactly what you want if you're capturing a memory. If, for example, I'm sitting in a restaurant and I want to take a photo of whatever it is that I'm eating, but I still also want to have my wife in frame and maybe a bit of context of our surrounding area, I can do that with the 28mm lens without having to get up on and taking a few steps back. Or take this image of me in the same restaurant shot by the missus. You can clearly make out the subject, but you also get a feeling of the setting. Or this shot of Corinna casually hanging around the pool, but you can still see a bit of Lake Como and the surrounding mountains in the frame as well. All these images that I took in our living room, they are nothing special, but yet I think they give enough context to capture the atmosphere of those days. You get the idea. 28mm is the right focal length if you want to frame your subject in a context that is fairly close to you. But it's also fairly versatile because, for example, I recently used it to take a few shots of our car, and this lens is certainly wide enough to allow for some decent interior shots, but it's not so wide that it would heavily distort the whole image or look unnatural. And so over the years I've taken countless photos of people, places, landscapes and things that I've been up to with this Leica Q2, and almost never have I wished for it to have any other focal length. However, with that being said, that completely changes the moment I get out of the door with the specific goal of taking photos, be it landscape photography, street photography, or whatever. Because when I'm just out to shoot photos, I just find it much easier to isolate a subject and frame it in a composition that makes sense when I'm shooting with something somewhere between 35 and 50 millimeters, but probably rather closer to 50 millimeters. Now, usually, especially for stuff like street photography, I will also be more comfortable if I have a lot more distance between me and my subject than I would if I were to shoot somebody or take a photo of somebody in the moment that I'm close to. But if I were to do that with my 28mm lens, that would mean that I would have to either get uncomfortably close to somebody that I don't know, or that I would have mostly too many other distracting elements in the frame, and that for the most part simply just doesn't work as a photo. And that kind of neatly brings us to two arguments that often pop up when we're talking about focal length, and especially fixed focal length and wider focal length, and that is zooming with your feet and cropping into your images. And so let's talk about that. And let's start with zooming with your feet, which sounds simple enough, but more often than not it's actually quite a stupid idea, because first of all, that might be pretty uncomfortable and not what you want, and secondly, that might actually ruin your composition. Okay, so this is an excellent case in point in terms of focal length and field of view are two completely different issues, and you cannot just zoom with your feet. So if, say, I would like to take a photo of this house with the mountains in the background, which I can do from here, but then I would like to be a bit closer to the house, it's a completely different issue if you just crop in or zoom in, if you have the ability with a different focal length, from just moving closer. Because if you do, what you will see is that the mountains will simply start to disappear behind the house. And if I were to get really close to the house, they'd be pretty much gone. And so that's the main issue, and that's the reason why you cannot just say that if you have a fixed focal length, just zoom with your feet. If you're zooming in with your feet, you might completely distort your image and you might not be able to get the same image that you actually wanted to get. Now that still leaves us with the option to just crop into the image. And with the Leica Q2, you do get a 45 megapixel sensor and a very high quality lens that certainly allows for a lot of detail. And with the Q3, the regular Q3, you even get a 60 megapixel sensor. So you do have a lot of room for cropping. Now, if you want to crop from a 28mm to a 43mm, so essentially to get the same field of view that you would get with the new Q3 43, you would have to apply pretty much an APS-C crop. And so if you do the math with this Leica Q2, you would end up with an image somewhere in the range of 28 megapixels. And if you also convert the equivalent field of view in terms of the bokeh, that would mean that you would be shooting with an f2.6 aperture. And so that's certainly not too shabby if you ask me. That's still plenty of resolution, and also the difference between an f2.0 and an f2.6 lens isn't that big. So yeah, I would say if you only shoot at a 43mm field of view occasionally, that would work probably well enough. With that being said though, once you've gotten kind of accustomed to looking at higher resolution images, especially if you also print them like I do for my print store, shameless plug by the way, you will certainly be able to notice the difference between a 45 megapixel full sensor readout, full quality image, and a cropped in image with about 28 megapixels of resolution. At least if you're looking from a distance that is probably too close. If you're standing a reasonable distance away from a print, it will still be totally fine. But if you like to get a little closer and just appreciate all the details, there are certainly more details there if you have more megapixels. Who would have thought? And so that basically means that if you're planning to shoot at 43mm a lot and you want to have the highest quality images that you can get, obviously it makes more sense to go with the Q343. So anyway, I certainly do have a place in my heart for this new Leica Q343, and I would absolutely love to have it for stuff like, again, as I said earlier, landscape photography and street photography in particular. And even though I haven't had the chance yet to actually use it in real life, I'm just fairly certain that the lens will be of the highest quality and that the body and everything else will be just as high quality as it is on my Leica Q2, and it will be just as rugged. And so in total, I think that makes for a very attractive package overall. The drawback of the 43mm lens is obviously that you get essentially the same problem in reverse. Only difference being that if you have a 43mm lens, you cannot simply zoom out. So with the 43, you're kind of stuck and you can either make it work or you don't. Now, if you are like most people and not like me, meaning that you just take pictures of your friends and families and gatherings and food at a restaurant with your iPhone instead of using a big camera, and you prefer to have a bigger and more serious camera for those occasions when you're actually out and about with the specific goal of creating art, well, then that probably doesn't really matter, because you always have your iPhone or whatever smartphone you're using with you, and that always comes with a lens in the neighborhood of 26, 24, 28 millimeters, and so that would work perfectly fine for that. And I do get that, and with that pairing, it might actually be sensible to ditch the Q2 or Q3 if you have that, and go with the 43 instead. But still, for me personally, it's just the simple fact that even though I do like to just go out and shoot for street photography, landscapes, whatever it may be, the simple fact of the matter is that in between working full time and, having friends and a family and other obligations, I simply do not get to do that as often. But since I'm fairly passionate about photography and I want to take photos as often as I can to, just get better at it and enjoy it, I just get a lot more use out of my Leica Q2 with the 28mm lens than I would out of a Leica Q3 with a 43mm lens. And so that is the reason why I think I will not sell my Leica Q2, but rather just stick with it. Now, if I had the money to just get both, I would do that. Probably, maybe, not quite sure, but fairly certain that I would be at least very tempted to do that. But I don't, and so, yeah, I think the Leica Q2 is the better choice for me because I get to use it more often and it works better in those day-to-day scenarios that I just find myself in more often. As I said in the beginning though, I think that the Leica Q3 43 will still be a huge win for Leica overall, because again, a lot of people were absolutely looking forward to Leica releasing a camera of this sort, and I've seen that James Popsis already has gotten one apparently, and that guy's been banging on about loving shooting a 40mm or anything in between 40 and 50 millimeters, and he gets to do that a lot. He gets to just travel and be out and about shooting with his favorite focal length and creating art, and so I'm very much looking forward to seeing what somebody like him will be able to create with a camera of this sort, which is pretty much tailor-made for that type of shooter that is out and about, that needs a camera, that is rugged, that can withstand the elements, that is fairly compact and offers that focal length. And so, James, if you're watching this for whatever reason, very much looking forward to your videos featuring the Q3 43. For me though, again, I will probably stick with the Q2 for a while, even though I do reserve the right to change my mind on that subject at any point in the future. That's all I got for you today. If you want to support this channel, you can check out my print store and maybe buy one, and that would help me to be able to spend more money on camera gear. But yeah, again, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I see you then. Take care. Bye.